Okay. Shen, are we good to go?
It's all you guys.
Okay, great. I will turn over to Tanya then.
Okay, so I'm Tania Dautlick. I'm Executive Director of Keep Durham Beautiful, and my office is in the General Services Department. I think I know most of you. And Mariel?
And I'm Mariel Klein. I'm the business services analyst in the city manager's office. And Tanya and I collaborated on this idea starter.
Yeah. And so we'd also like to give a special thanks to Shannon Delaney, who was our mentor, and also to Ovi and to all the people who made this idea starter exercise program experience possible, because it's been really meaningful and interesting to watch pivot, and we've done a great job, I think, as a whole group. So our initial project started with the idea of a sustainable city hall. We both had proposed idea starter concepts that dovetailed nicely, and so we were offered the opportunity to collaborate together, and so it's been really rewarding. And so we had a pre-COVID plan, and which I'll go into some detail sharing with you. And then Mariel will share with you what we did during our COVID pivot. And then we'll both share with you some of our evaluations and recommendations for the future. We determined that there was an opportunity to reduce and divert waste from single-use plastics, servingware, and other food waste that was generated through city employee functions and functions where we were potentially interacting with the public, but where city employees were making decisions about products that were used for serving, food that was served, and how it was disposed of. And so we wanted to explore how we could reduce waste both at the beginning and then divert further waste from the landfill. So based on some of our observations, we came up with this, with these goals. So our observations came from, first, a waste audit, which was also affectionately called a dumpster sort at General Services a couple of years ago, where we literally dumped out the contents of the dumpster and categorized it. And I don't know if you can see that little chart there, but what it shows is that between the recyclable items and the compostable items that were in the dumpster, 77% of all the waste that was in the dumpster should not have been there, was not trash. It could have been diverted to either recycling or composting. So that told us that there was a great opportunity for improving our practices and setting up the right tools in place and the right awareness and education to make that kind of second nature for our staff. We also have heard and interviewed some custodians, and from their observations, we know that there is contamination in the recycling bin, which is trash in the recycling bin, trash or compostable items in the recycling. And there's also recyclables in the trash bin. So there's another opportunity for improvement. So we thought that we could approach this from the idea of first reducing waste, which is the first part of the reduce, reuse, recycle concept. And then secondly, from a diversion viewpoint, which is to put what we can into recycling and compost rather than the landfill. Composting and recycling are two important, are two essential tools for diverting waste from the landfill. And this is important to all of us as city employees because these goals exist in both our citywide strategic plan and our sustainability roadmap. The citywide plan has a diversion rate goal of 30%, and it's currently sitting at 23%, at least according to the website. That might be different now. And the sustainability roadmap has the goal of reducing the amount of waste per household, the amount of solid waste per household that goes into the landfill by 10% by this year, and by 50%, and I'm not sure by what year, but eventually by 50%, which is an awesome goal. Okay. And so we want to just explore how we can do pilots to start moving these efforts forward and engage our employees in being sustainable, having sustainable practices. So we talked about our key stakeholders. We identified a group that we wanted to work with at City Hall. So our city employees who were working in the departments that we'll share with you at City Hall would be our kind of target audience, our participants. And the departments that would have a stake in what we were doing because it might involve some work on their part and ultimately some potential practice implementation were solid waste management and general services custodial team. General services has been implementing composting by hiring a service from Compost Now and originally Food Forward for several years at 2011 Faith Street. And we have noticed that there were some successes and some room for improvement with that process. City Council has also been testing composting. Prior to their council meetings with their council meal, they went through a period of time where they were bringing their using compostable serviceware and bringing their composted items to general services to drop it off. So our survey showed that our city employees that we contacted do want to be better stewards of the environment, but are looking for more tools and more information to do so. And as we discussed in the sustainability roadmap, we have ambitious goals for waste reduction citywide, and we're better to start than with our own staff. Okay. Uh-oh. Are we frozen? Mariel, can you switch the slide? Oh, thank you. So we proposed some ideas. How might we encourage our city employees to understand and increase their sustainable actions? And how might we focus our efforts on city-sponsored events to model food-related waste reduction activities? So we determined that a lot of the opportunity for improvement would be around planning how to serve meals and functions. So be it a party or a pre-meeting meal or a meal during an event. And then we realized that we might be able to use the employees that we are engaging as a mini pilot, as a model to understand what questions and barriers the general public might have when we ultimately are asking them also to reduce their waste, increase their recycling, and consider learning how to compost. And then finally, how might we involve city leadership to continue to develop these practices, to continue to prioritize sustainability and waste reduction through our strategic plans and through encouraging behaviors by setting us all up for success. Okay. So we initiated a City Hall pilot. The three departments that we decided to engage were the Budget and Management Services, City Manager's Office, and Human Resources. We selected them because they were centralized in City Hall. We'd have easy access to them. They had already expressed some interest in improving their sustainable behaviors, and we had various connections to them, and all total that comprised about 100 employees. So we conducted a survey to determine their baseline waste reduction habits and knowledge, and we received responses from 37 participants. The goals from our pilot, which would include education, training, setting up a space or a waste station that has signage and the appropriate bins for trash, recycling, and compost, and then follow-up education and follow-up surveys. So our plan was to use Compost Now to provide the bins for composting. We would collect and measure the compost, and then we'd follow up with a survey to gauge our positive, what went well and what could we improve on, and questions that arose. Okay. So from the survey, the average rating of the culture, our employees rated our city's culture of sustainability and waste reduction just a 3 out of a 5. So those respondents, 50 of those respondents, 51% recycle at work. And we know we do have the recycling bins at work. That was a little bit surprising. And 17% of the respondents compost at work. We think that those respondents were primarily from budget and management services because they were already in the process of doing a micro pilot of composting. So they actually had access to a compost bin in their workspace. The most utilized green behaviors that they shared were recycling and using reusable straws instead of disposable straws. Their motivation for reducing waste was caring for the environment, perceived financial benefits, so reusing a cup and other reuse items. And then they were interested in having things that were easy and practical. When we asked why people don't compost, because the majority of our respondents do not compost, they didn't feel that they knew enough to get started. It also didn't feel convenient to them, and there were some concerns about bugs or pests in the environment where the composting was happening. One of our first pilots was at the budget retreat in February. We had 2 retreats 2 weeks apart, and at both retreats, we did a little bit of an introduction, prepared the environment to have the 3 appropriate bins for trash, recycling, and composting. And then we had staff on hand to answer questions and direct people to place their waste in the correct locations. And we had signage to also further educate. And also very importantly, we started with the planners of the retreat selecting items that were reducing waste. So we had low impact compostable servingware and all of everything that could be done in bulk was done in bulk rather than individual serving materials. So we didn't have chip bags. I think candy wrappers were about the only thing that we determined would actually need to go into the trash other than any trash that employees brought with them. And so we had some great successes. You can see the picture of all of the compost that was filled up after the event. And we also learned that there were a lot of questions, and there was a great opportunity for education about how to use these systems to the best of their use. And next slide. And I mentioned that the budget and management office and general services were already having compost as micro pilots in their workspaces. And again, this showed us that there was a lot of education needed, signage needed, and employees, once they felt knowledgeable, were willing to participate. And next slide.
All right, so I'm going to pick up and talk about how we pivoted during COVID. So we we're able to start with the budget retreat pilot, but pretty soon after that, in March, of course, we started transitioning into working remotely, and it became pretty clear that we were not going to be able to run our city hall pilot the way that we had envisioned, like lots of pretty much every idea starter project. So we pivoted to wanting to do something at home for employees to be able to hopefully start or think about composting at home. And focus more on education and training than actually giving employees like hands-on opportunities to start composting, since that would be difficult to get physical things to employees at home. And so our key stakeholders remain city employees, but we also, since people were at home, expanded it to now hopefully employees' families could also participate in composting efforts. So we envisioned how we might educate employees about how to compost at home and empower them to continue to compost if and when we return to full-time work or more permanent part-time work at City Hall. And so our new plan was to open the educational component of composting to all city employees, not just employees from our 3 pilot departments. But we did want to do some kind of pilot effort. And so we retooled our pilot to participants from still the 3 same departments, but giving them educational tools to be able to begin composting at home. And our goal and hope is that still that we can continue these educational tools and at some point still develop a plan for a City Hall composting pilot, and then eventually hopefully have a scenario where employees are composting at work as well as composting at home. So I'm going to go through the 4-week pilot that we developed with so we ended up dividing it into 4 weeks, with each week having a different educational topic. And for people watching this presentation or listening later, we are happy to send you a link to the educational materials. They're just in 4 separate folders on a Google Drive. So we wanted to make them really accessible for people. So we ended up soliciting 8 participants from our 3 pilot departments, which is not a whole lot, but considering that this was back in the beginning of the pandemic, March, April, May, and there was a lot of other things going on, we were happy with the 8 people that we got. So our pilot started with recycling for the topic for week 1. And we provided resources from Keep Durham Beautiful and from the State Department of Environmental Quality about what should go in the blue bins versus garbage bins, because we found that there were still a lot of questions about that, and why recycling is still a viable economic and sustainability practice, because we are getting some questions about that also. We provided some links to resources for recycling odd items that can't go into the municipal blue bins, like electronics, stuff like that. And we challenged participants to start recycling something they hadn't before, or to upcycle an old item to make something new rather than actually putting the item into the recycling bin. Week 2, we introduced composting as a topic and encouraged people to think about what kinds of composting effort might work best for their environment. So we introduced reasons why composting is helpful for both the environment and for the city, from a waste diversion and financial savings perspective. We described various types of composting. So in the graphic to the left of the slide, you can see how we divided We focused on 3 different styles of composting. The first is vermicomposting or a worm bin, backyard composting, and then industrial compost, which is like a compost now service where you would pay a fee and your compost would be collected and put into an industrial composting facility. So we described these 3 types of composting and gave pros and cons to help people think through which method of composting might be best for them. Week 3 continued the concept of composting. So we were thinking that by then participants would have thought through or even begun a composting effort in their backyard or in a worm bin. And so we talked to how to maintain compost after it's been started. And we helped participants troubleshoot potential issues with their compost. And we closed out the 4-week educational component with a week focused on waste reduction in general. So we introduced concepts of reusing food scraps in soups or other things like that, smart shopping so that you're buying only enough that you need and not throwing out fruits and vegetables, and other ways to reduce waste, because as Tania stated, reducing the amount of waste that you actually generate is the top way to be more sustainable. And we talked to issues of food waste and equity and how food waste generally contributes to global emissions. So after that 4-week home composting pilot, we did some evaluations. We had some successes. The biggest we think is that now we have material to use for future composting efforts. Of course, hopefully if and when we run this pilot in person in City Hall, we don't have to start at ground zero for running trainings or developing educational materials. We already have it. We did get some positive feedback from participants that they were learning new things. And Tania and Keep Durham Beautiful was able to use some of this educational material to build a new composting informational page on their website. We learned a lot of lessons. The biggest one probably was related to communication, which we had some issues with, in that we were not super successful at getting a lot of feedback or questions or photos of compost. It was hard for us to communicate back and forth with our pilot participants. So we thought a lot about and are still thinking about how we reach people meaningfully, but in their own time, especially during the pandemic. As I mentioned before, this was during the spring and early summer months. And so there were a lot of other things on people's minds other than composting. And so we were thinking and are still thinking about how to connect composting to other topics in order to lessen the burden or the impact of having to think about composting as kind of its own effort that doesn't connect to anything else. We also missed the opportunity to do a post survey, and so we lost some data collection opportunities there. Also, again, due to the pandemic and some other timing issues, we weren't able to get out each of the weeks of educational material sequentially. So like between week 2 and week 3 of the materials, there was a couple of weeks where participants weren't receiving any materials from us. And so we lost some interest during those weeks. So when we do this next time in person, however we do it, we definitely want to make sure that we get those weeks out in, the right order. And next time we would like to have a wider audience in order to have more communication and get some better data. So thinking about next steps, of course, we're still thinking about how to re-engage employees when we're ready to transition this pilot into City Hall. So going back to those 8 people and finding out if they were able to continue or even start composting at home, and maybe survey them again or just talk to them to see what some of their successes and failures were with their composting efforts. Will this ever happen? we don't know. And how would we run this pilot if our work schedules are permanently altered, where we're, not all in City Hall at the same time, working from City Hall, 1 or 2 days out of the week, not sure how we would run this pilot. And as Tania was speaking about earlier, still thinking about how we might apply what we learned in this pilot to the city's residential composting program. So an unexpected but really important and ended up being one of the highlights of this composting pilot effort ended up being 2 virtual composting training sessions that we were able to run that were hosted by Mariel, who's a solid waste manager. She reached out to us because she has years and years of composting training and education and experience, really a wealth of information and knowledge. And we're just so lucky that she works for the city now and that she reached out to us and offered to help. So we certainly took her up on the offer. And again, of course, because of COVID, held 2 virtual training sessions. The first session, we had 13 participants. It was advertised strictly to city employees because we had never done something like this before. We ended up having a few tech issues. It was really hot out and my phone started overheating. And so we ended up actually having to split it into 2 sessions. But the second session went much better. We had over 30 participants, and this was due mostly to it being advertised more widely via Keep Durham Beautiful and also the Compost Council. We were able to resolve most of the tech issues. Actually, we ended up going overtime because Mariel is such a wealth of information, and we produced a recording for participants that were not able to stay for the extra time. Again, we're going to explore putting this maybe on the city's learning management system or another way that city employees can view this on their own time. But if you would like a link to this training video, we are happy to provide it. And it was a huge success in the post survey for both of the sessions combined. We got an average rating of 4.9 stars for training content. Every single participant said that they learned something new. People were really excited about the format. Actually, they said that it was like being on a field trip. And Mariel actually, the coolest part was that she actually built a compost pile during the training. So she was able to get some compostable materials, food scraps, egg containers from various sources and build a compost pile during the training, which was really helpful for people who had never actually seen what it looks like to build a compost pile. So we want to give a huge thank you and a shout out to Mariel for her expertise, enthusiasm, and leadership. We really, really appreciated her volunteering, and it was the 2 training sessions we did with her ended up without a doubt being the highlight of this composting experience.
So to summarize, throughout all of our various micro pilots and the final 2 pilots that we were able to put fully into place, we want to emphasize our observance that we really need to share with our employees continued training, awareness, and education about the best practices. Repetition of messaging is so important, as well as signage and appropriately staged receptacles to just set people up for success and take away any confusion, whether it's just trash and recycling as the 2 options, or whether it's the 3 option system, trash, composting, and recycling. The signage is essential, and reminders in advance and training so that people feel confident in making the choices that they make. We're very confident that using city employees as a pilot group is a great model. What we'd recommend for the future when we do this on on an in-person scale in City Hall would be to conduct before waste audits in the office. When Keep Durham Beautiful conducted one at General Services, we used waste reduction partners who came in and conducted the audit for us. So that was an option that we were planning to look into if we had been able to actually implement this. Offering training either remotely through pre-recorded videos or online training or in person to city employees will be important to get people started and answer the questions. And we think it's important that city employee waste reduction as a goal remains in strategic plans of each department and of the city as a whole, so that we can be leading by example. And finally, the opportunity to use the questions and experiences of our employees will inform how we can engage the general public, because our employees are members of the general public and by and large have the same questions that members of the public might have when we're encouraging the public to reduce their waste, to make best use of their recycling bins, to utilize their yard waste containers, and ultimately to participate in an eventual curbside organics composting program. So we hope that this has been informative. We really enjoyed working on it together and with all of you who engaged with us on the project. And we look forward to, to when we can, implementing something in City Hall. Mariel, do you want to say anything to close out?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And I'll give all of our materials to Shannon or whoever so that we can get them sent out to whoever might want to take a look at them. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That was so great. I'm aware of the time and I want Sean to be able to present his. So please feel free, if you have questions, add them in the chat box, and we'll just compile any questions till the end. And Sean, with that, I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Great, thanks. Let me get my share screen set up. Okay, hopefully that is working.
Wonderful. Yeah.
All right, so thank you all for coming to my final Idea Starter project presentation. My project is called Grow Your Garden, Grow Your Community, what I've described as the fail slow approach to iterative design. And the reason for that subtitle will become clearer as we get further in. So for the last couple of years, I have had a box garden in my backyard. My wife and I moved to East Durham, a couple blocks east of Roxborough, very close to downtown. It's a transitioning neighborhood, and every year we end up with more produce than we can actually consume on our own. And so in 2019, I gave some of that produce to my neighbors, and I was really struck by the fact that they really talked about how they appreciated having more fresh vegetables in their diet, and that they wish that they had the time and the skill and the space to be able to grow their own gardens. And as we all know, vegetables are a really important part of a healthy diet, but there are, in some communities, of course, issues around access. And then, of course, anyone who buys fresh vegetables knows vegetables can be super expensive. So I kind of had this thought experiment I started playing with, and I had this vision of, what if we could create a network of people across the city who were planting extra vegetables and then giving them to their neighbors. So the map I've thrown up here is just, a representation of my thought experiment. Every green dot representing someone who is growing extra vegetables and then handing them out to friends and neighbors. And the idea would be like, oh, okay, that's one way on a micro scale that we address issues around access to fruits and vegetables, hunger issues. So, I played with that idea and then I kind of put it aside, I shelved it. until I got the 2019 Idea Starter email. And I thought, well, what if we could take that plaza between City Hall and the annex, and we could transform it from the barren concrete that it is in this photo into something like this. So this image is from a urban garden in Chicago. And I was like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if you could put box gardens all over the plaza? And then what I pitched to Idea Starter was that people who worked for the city could maintain those gardens, but anyone who wanted access to the vegetables could have them. And in that way, then you could think about scaling it up. And all of a sudden you've got box gardens on empty city property across the city. And in that way, you start looking at reducing issues around hunger and again, access to vegetables. So that's the idea I pitched. And luckily for me, the folks accepted the idea. And I started in the winter of 2020 working on the project. So at this point, I want to take a step back. And I think everybody's on the call today knows about some of the fundamentals to Idea Starter. But in case there are other people who don't, prototyping is really at the heart of the experience. And so the idea is you're going to explore an aspect of your project and try and figure out what are those assumptions you're making in terms of the project, and sort of use that prototype to figure out whether those assumptions are correct. And the idea is that you want to get something in front of people very quickly. So there's this concept of fail fast. And then when you figure out what worked and what didn't work, you then iterate on what you learned. And so that's what I was working on and developing as we moved into the spring of 2020. And of course, as we all know, at that point, COVID happened. And most of us who were working at City Hall went home. And on top of that, the idea that people would gather around a box garden and collaborate to grow vegetables just didn't seem safe, right? So even if we had been at City Hall, nobody was going to be gardening together. So quite honestly, I kind of put aside my thoughts of the prototype for 4, even 6 weeks, until ultimately Shannon and Ovi came back and are like, okay, what's your plan? What are you doing? What's your new prototype? How are you pivoting? I feel like pivot is one of the words for 2020. And so I said, okay, so my 2.0 prototype. And I really went back to where I had started, right? So I had started with this idea of neighbors growing vegetables for neighbors, but I'd also become interested in some of the stuff that in talking to people, I'd realized, like, if you're growing vegetables and you're giving them to other people, you're defining what vegetables they get to eat. And also it creates a cycle of dependency, right? And what you really want to do is think about, well, how do people gain a skill so that they can be independent actors? And so at the heart of my 2.0 prototype was, will people want to start a garden at home? And then will people want to help and support those new gardeners? So I built in this concept of mentor gardeners. And then because I was really interested still in the issue of sharing of the vegetables, will sharing what they grow enhance the gardening experience? So in June, I launched my prototype. I had 6 new gardeners, and they were drawn from 3 departments: Public Works, Budget and Management, and Technology Solutions. I had 6 active mentor gardeners and another half dozen or so who were not as engaged, but who would sort of pop in and out and provide support. Each of the new gardeners got 2 plants, and they got the soil and the pots they needed to start those plants. And then I was using Slack as a community space. So how'd it go? Well, I'm really pleased to say that people planted their vegetables. And I'll be honest and say that that was a concern I had, that I was going to hand these vegetables off, and almost all of that was done contactless, right? And then people would put them in their cars and they would just stay in those cars. They would never make it out and into the pots. But that's not what happened. All 6 of the new gardeners planted their plants. I've got a shot from the Slack space here showing one of them, touting the fact he's got his tomato plant and his pepper plant planted. So that was great. I was super excited. I felt like that was a first win. We also had lots of great engagement in Slack, at least initially. So people got on the space and they talked about who they were as a gardener, or what they wanted to, why they were interested in gardening, maybe why they hadn't started gardening yet. And then over the first couple of weeks, people would pop in and, ask questions about things that were happening, or they would share what they were getting. So that was great. It was really fantastic. Honestly, it was much better than I had even anticipated. Like, the amount of uptick by people was really amazing to me, and was definitely a lesson. I think ends up being a key lesson that I learned. I think the other part, though, is that some people struggled with the Slack space. They didn't get the announcements, like they wouldn't get the notifications, or they just had trouble navigating the space itself. I also think another issue was people weren't in Slack regularly, right? Like, several people in my group were part of the prototype, and we use Slack all the time. And so it was very comfortable for them, and people had it open, but other people didn't, and they sort of forgot about it, which meant that over time, the amount of energy in the Slack space declined. And so I'm going to talk about why I'm calling it a fail slow prototype. Well, what would failing fast with a garden look like, right? It would mean all of the plants died. So I definitely wouldn't have wanted a fail fast for my project, but I really hadn't thought about that vegetables take a long time to grow, right? So at a month, I did a check-in, and none of the new gardeners had anything to harvest. And that wasn't surprising, right? People might have had like a bud here, or a bud there, or little cherry tomatoes that were starting to come, but nothing more than that. So that was a little bit, since on some level, I had really premised it on successfully growing vegetables. That was very stress inducing. But I have to say, everybody said they were still enjoying the experience. And if they wanted anything more, it was that they wanted more interaction with mentor gardeners and with each other, which again gets us back to the central role that the Slack space played and that I hadn't anticipated. And again, that was a real lesson for me. So, but time did pass, and people's gardens did start to flourish. They were able to harvest their vegetables. And so all three of these photos are from the Slack space. I'll also say that because we got so late, like we started later than we should have in terms of when the plants went in the ground. And so, but it also meant that people continued to harvest right up until the first frost. So Ovi mentioned that earlier, before we started recording, that she, Bob, her tomato plant I'd given her, was continuing to produce tomatoes. And that was true for a lot of people. So that was fantastic. Okay, so let's go back to those 2.0 questions. Will people want to start a garden at home? Yes, I had six new gardeners, and all six of them stayed through to the end. And what was cool is that people tended to supplement what they the two plants I gave them. So Tasha Johnson was one of the new gardeners, and she emailed me recently and was like, oh, we had a potato that sprouted, and so we stuck it in the ground. And here's the photo of the potatoes that we just harvested from that potato. So that was really cool. Will people want to help the new gardeners? Yeah, that was definitely another lesson, is that, the mentor gardeners were on and engaged in the Slack space very quickly. And they weren't only sharing with the new gardeners, but they were sharing with each other. Will sharing what they grow enhance the experience? So that was the wrong question, right? I was so focused on vegetables and producing vegetables and sharing them with other people that I didn't see the other sharing that was going on. So when I thought about the grow your community part of the project, I thought about it in terms of each individual gardener sharing with the people in their immediate space. But what really happened was it was about growing a community of gardeners, and the Slack space again was like, well, it was the only way we could do it, right? Because it was COVID. But so I think that the sharing of knowledge and experience was fundamental to the reason that people stayed engaged and that they were excited about the project. And so the vegetable part was sort of actually secondary to the whole experience in some ways. Okay, so the takeaways. Lesson number one, gardens mature slowly, right? I mean, I felt really lucky is that people did stay involved in the project, and I feel like all 6 of the new gardeners were successful. But definitely I would want to build in short-term incentives to keep people motivated. A simple way to do that with a gardening project is just to go ahead and have people plant herbs as well as vegetables, or to do microgreens, which again have a much shorter turnaround time. Technology can be a hindrance. So like I said, the Slack space had a lot of good aspects to it, but it also, I think, because people didn't know it, because it wasn't something they had open all the time, it did present some challenges. And so in some ways, I feel like it didn't fit the needs. And I had found this platform that I was really comfortable with, but wasn't necessarily a platform that anybody else knew. And so if I was going to move forward, I would say, let's try it in teams and see how that works. I'd also say that because it turns out that the gardening community is so important, that even when we're post-COVID, if you continue the project, it's still important to have a space, like a virtual space, where people can gather and share information. And the third lesson is, so as I said, this project was as much about growing community as it was about growing vegetables. And because I didn't understand that, I didn't understand that I needed to build architecture into the project or into the prototype that would allow me to sustain it, right? So everything, like making the Slack space happen, really fell to me. And I am not like the social media guy. So again, if you iterate on this, you have to realize like, okay, so I have to empower other people to be engaged. There has to be sort of more of a plan in place for how you're going to keep people involved and engaged, much more so than I did this time around. Okay, next steps. So I did an end of the project survey, and of the people who responded, 70% said they'd be interested in staying involved. So I've got a meeting I need to schedule for December, and the focus is going to be talking about winter gardening, either sort of microgreens or thinking about planting probably in like February. But I also want to engage people who participate in this question of, you know, what's the vision for the project? What do they want it to include? And a big part of that is figuring out, how do I get additional people to buy into sort of taking more of a leadership role in the project. So I think the last thing that I want to say before I wrap up is just like, to me, this was an amazing project, not only because it gave me a chance to work through my box garden idea, but because it allowed me to think a lot about, I guess day-to-day work at City Hall, probably for most of us, is very task oriented, right? You've got a problem that's right in front of you and you've got to get something done. And so you're sort of banging through those daily tasks, and having the opportunity to sort of step back and think more creatively about a problem and what are the different factors you want to think about, and how do you work through a problem and think about that you're going to iterate on solving that problem, was like incredibly helpful for me. So whatever happens in terms of the box garden project, I feel like the time I spent going through this process was extremely helpful in terms of sort of skill building overall. And that, I think, is it. That's what I got.